Though Azeroth was saved, the tenuous pact between the Horde and the Alliance has all but evaporated.
The space it entered as a competitor is largely dead, in the sense that WoW takes up all the oxygen in the room. Experiments in virtual world design began to dry up, to curtail their ambitions, to being nibbles around the edge of WoW's design. Blizzard launched World of Warcraft in 2004, forever killing the MMO genre under a tide of orcs and Draenei, the weird space squids. That's not all though, they also killed the RTS genre by never releasing a Warcraft 4. We all know that's what we wanted, right? Or is it just me that wanted that over World of Warcraft? It's probably just me. Blizzard also murdered public discourse online, obviously, with their unofficial mod spin-off that they didn't control, League of Legends. I mean, of course, it's all their fault. It's all Blizzard's fault, right? All of this sounds a bit ridiculous, right? World of Warcraft and Blizzard did not kill the MMO genre. They didn't kill the RTS genre. They didn't kill public discourse. We did that a long time ago. But World of Warcraft did have an outsized impact on MMOs for years, especially in the decade after its launch, where it essentially chose where the market would go to the detriment of a lot of players. When World of Warcraft released, the MMO genre was still relatively new. Internet access was just becoming widespread, allowing games like this to actually exist and prosper. And its monstrous success would forever set the tone for MMOs going forward. A more appropriate title for this would have been something like How WoW Killed MMOs for Almost a Decade Due to Its Massive Success and Ensuring Cowardice of MMO Developers. And that statement, well, depending on who you ask, it's kind of true. I'm going to go into 3 pillars of why World of Warcraft had such a negative impact on the genre for so long. The pillars are the clones, early closures, and loss of struggle. Have you picked up on a theme yet? Outside of the last one, the loss of struggle, most of these actually aren't WoW's fault alone. They're stories about market trends and how things were developed in response to World of Warcraft's success. And I couldn't put it any better than what Ralph Koster said. World of Warcraft effectively made MMOs perfect, and in the process, it killed them. Before we get too deep into how World of Warcraft ruined everything we've ever loved, we need some context for just how much the genre seemingly exploded overnight. Steady growth became exponential. I'm about to go into some subscriber numbers here, so take this with a giant grain of salt. Numbers aren't always reported by MMOs, and when they are, they sometimes use different metrics like registered accounts versus active subscriptions. They're just general vague numbers from what I could find through some research, but they do at least give us a lens into some of the things that were happening. One of the first big MMOs was Ultima Online, the first MMO to top 100,000 players. It peaked at over 250,000 before it beginning its decline in 2003, the year before WoW's launch. One of the largest to come after Ultima Online, and one that is near and dear to the heart of this channel, was Everquest, which peaked at just over 550,000 subscribers by the end of 2004, right as 2 major new MMOs launched. Now, while Everquest and Ultima Online may be 2 of the most well-known games in the West, in the early days of MMOs, a little game and its sequel from NCSoft boasted some incredible numbers that dwarf both of those. Lineage and Lineage 2 hit peaks of 3.2 million players and 2.1 million players respectively. In none of these cases, though, did MMOs break into the mainstream for games. So we have our high population games from this era of MMOs, from 500,000 to 3.2 million, but there were other successful MMOs in that time period too. Dark Age of Camelot launched in 2001 and peaked at 250,000 players in 2004. Star Wars Galaxies launched in 2003 and peaked at 300,000 by 2004. RuneScape wouldn't break 1 million players until 2009, 8 years after it launched. Some of these games may have been your favorites. You may even still play them, but compared to WoW, well, kind of complete failures. Or at least that's what it seemed like at the time. To call World of Warcraft a monster doesn't really cover it. Launching in 2004, World of Warcraft peaked at 12 million active subscribers in 2010. By 2014, 10 years after its launch, World of Warcraft had 100 million lifetime players, a number that has only grown since then. And keep in mind that World of Warcraft has never been free to play. To put this in perspective, Everquest's peak of 550,000 in 2004 is about 4.6% of World of Warcraft's peak players in 2010. In one launch, everything changed.
You are not prepared.
In the years after WoW's launch, innovation in the MMO genre largely dried up. Even games that were launched around the same time or before it tried to rework themselves to be more like WoW. Notably, Everquest 2 and Star Wars Galaxies. WoW seemingly found the formula, but in the years that followed, it proved that copying that formula alone wasn't enough. WoW brought with it some notable changes to the genre. Things like leveling through quests instead of mob grinding, extensive use of instances, class-specific talent trees, increased solo options, move to the Holy Trinity versus the Quaternity or the classless system that existed before it, increased solo options, and more focus on carrying you from hub to hub on designated pathways, and all of these among several other smaller changes. Things like crafting that had been brought forward with Star Wars Galaxies and even Ultima Online were pulled back and simplified. In-game housing was non-existent, as was animal taming beyond the hunter class in a limited fashion. The problem wasn't necessarily that WoW changed things. Innovation was important in MMOs, and that's what WoW did. Each game that had come before WoW had emulated or iterated on things before it, and WoW did the same thing, making systems from different games, refining, changing, or cutting and moving forward. The problem was the success and the resulting cowardice from WoW and other studios in response to it. I believe the success of WoW led other MMOs to try and copy it to such an extent it stifled innovation in the MMO genre for almost a decade. An arms race to duplicate rather than iterate began. In the mad dash to capitalize on the explosive popularity of World of Warcraft, games were made modeling its tenets, but almost always doing it just a little bit worse. That was the opposite of what happened with games before, like Everquest and Ultima Online. You couldn't have two MMOs that were more different from each other, yet they were both at the vanguard of a young genre. They were competing for the same small group of MMO players, but offered different experiences and both pushed the genre forward. Could the same be said for someone logging into Warhammer Online? Was it that different from World of Warcraft? What about Runes of Magic? Sure, the lore was different, but wasn't combat awfully similar? Even the graphics? Didn't it also rely heavily on quest hubs? If you've been around MMORPGs for any extended period of time, you've probably heard one or both of these terms often. The WoW clone or the WoW killer. They refer to two different things, but essentially they're establishing an indisputable fact. At least to Western audiences, World of Warcraft is and has been the unquestioned king of MMOs for almost 20 years. Massively OP calls this the WoW clone era from 2004 to 2009. This is when you had games like Runes of Magic, Lord of the Rings Online, Warhammer Online, Allods Online, Order and Chaos Online, and countless others. MMOs.com has an entire list dedicated to WoW clones that look like actual shot-for-shot remakes of the game. Games from this era, and honestly beyond it, haven't just taken bits and pieces from World of Warcraft the way WoW took from Everquest and Ultima Online. They've actually in many ways created their entire game around what WoW is. Action bars with short global cooldowns, talent trees, quest hubs, solo play, shorter contained instant dungeons, instance PvP, 24 and smaller raids. MMOs that launched after 2004 looked a whole lot more like World of Warcraft than Everquest, Star Wars Galaxies, DAOC, RuneScape, or Ultima Online. A king had been crowned, but 100 fool's gold imitations were lining up to pick off some strays. But this all began before World of Warcraft began the massive success it was. Look no further than the sequel to Everquest, Everquest 2. A game that launched a few weeks before WoW, Everquest 2 was utterly destroyed by WoW. There were some similarities early on, and even rumors that Everquest 2's development was changed before launch to more closely mirror WoW. But it was after launch when we saw the great heel turn. After launch, Everquest 2 made a hard pivot, seeing WoW's success. Group-only mobs became solo mobs, advancement became easier. If you played at this time like I did, you logged in one day to find all the group-only NPCs in Itulos had suddenly become solo mobs. It was disorienting to say the least. This couldn't overcome its issues though. The strain it put on computers, the pull of its predecessor Everquest still being strong, and that what it tried to do, what it tried to emulate from World of Warcraft, WoW was just doing better. Not content with one failed attempt at emulating WoW, SOE tried to do the same with one of its other games, Star Wars Galaxies. Star Wars Galaxies had struggled for a time with a lack of end-game group or raid content, but it made up for it with an exceptional classless system that relied heavily on skill trees that made you make difficult decisions on your build, creating your own class. It also had phenomenal non-combat systems that still stand up today, like their crafting, harvesting, decorating, and entertaining skills. In many ways, Star Wars Galaxies had blended some of the best parts of Ultima Online and Everquest and slapped a Star Wars IP over it. But it was in trouble. Shortly after World of Warcraft came out, populations in Star Wars Galaxies were declining, despite the popularity of the Star Wars prequels. Perhaps the biggest issues facing Star Wars Galaxies from 2003 to 2005 were a lack of content and bugs, though the removal of popular group experience bonuses infuriated large swaths of the player base. Enter the NGE, or New Game Enhancements. This, essentially, was the WoWification of SWG. The NGE wasn't really a fix for any of the game's problems. It is instead an overhaul for the game in pretty dramatic ways. November of 2005, a year after WoW's launch, SOE announced the New Game Enhancements for SWG, a top-to-bottom revamp of much of what made SWG's system SWG. The 34 professions were whittled down to 9 classes, eliminating much of the player choice that had made the game unique. WoW-like levels were introduced where they had previously been none. Combat was changed to become faster, like WoW. What had once been a sandbox game with issues but fondly remembered for its sandbox features, dropped most of those in what feels like a thinly veiled attempt to capitalize on the success of a certain MMO. And again, it did it all just a little bit worse than how WoW was doing it. So we know that MMOs were copying WoW and mostly just doing it badly. How did this impact innovation though? Well, some of it comes from what WoW didn't do, what it left behind when it picked and chose how to build what would become the biggest MMO. An interview 10 years ago with Raph Koster, lead designer of Ultima Online and creative director from SWG, has some interesting insights on the subject. Among things left by the wayside were features that were proven. Gone were the richer pet systems that had driven so much engagement from players in earlier games. Player housing, past and future sources of endless devotion and revenue in other games was absent. Never mind stuff like towns and politics and the like. Crafting took massive steps backwards from the heights it had been developed into in Galaxies or even Sims Online, and went back to being more like that in Everquest. Even the robust character customization that we slaved over in Galaxies, a system which today is in every RPG on Earth, was gone. Crafting, animal taming, dedicated CC, even bard classes for people familiar with mechanics used extensively in Ultima Online all fell by the wayside for years. If you've never played Ultima Online, imagine a class with little combat ability that could provoke 2 NPCs to attack each other. Boy, that was fun. And honestly, if you're a developer in this time period, it makes some sense to abandon these things because the audience was saying, we want WoW. The problem was, how are you going to out-WoW WoW? And even if you do manage to do it well enough to attract some of those players that are enjoying that particular type of gameplay, What are you going to do when the entire genre has been doing the same thing for about 10 years? And the audience finally grows tired of it and wants something new or something old. The WoW clone morphed into the WoW killer era, with some games taking direct aim at WoW to take the throne. Don't mistake this for courage though, as most of these games were still sticking to the core systems of WoW, the proven success of WoW. Perhaps two of the most well-known WoW killers were Age of Conan by Funcom and Warhammer Online by Mythic Entertainment. Each took direct aim at WoW, each had decent launches, each failed spectacularly due to lack of content, bugs, and overall just poor choices made by the teams. While Age of Conan diverged somewhat from WoW's design with its combat, graphics, and more mature themes, it was still a quest hub heavy MMO that followed much of what WoW had laid out. Warhammer Online expanded on PvP and allowed PvE to suffer while essentially playing like a less polished version of WoW. Age of Conan still exists in maintenance mode, while Warhammer Online is relegated to emulation servers, with official support ending for the game in December of 2013. There is some irony in Warhammer Online, a game that used the IP that obviously inspired Warcraft, being so completely consumed by the shadow of its predecessor, to the point where it would eventually close. Speaking of closures. Oh, so your MMO didn't hit 1 million players? Well, then it's
absolutely failed and it's time to close that shit.
One of the hallmarks of the post-WoW era was the increasingly high expectations for MMORPGs from audiences and publishers. Ask most people now if Everquest is successful and they'll report it as a dead game. After all, it has less than 100,000 players. But it's an MMO that's been going on for 24 years and is about to launch its 30th expansion. A game in active development with a healthy player base, making the company money while also serving up a game and content that its players enjoy. I suggest though that if Everquest launched in 2007, it might not have been so lucky. WoW reset the bar of what was possible in an MMO, and all of those clones, they just couldn't come close. Take a look at some of these games that opened and closed or went into maintenance mode since WoW launched. Vanguard Saga of Heroes, 2007, peaked at 120,000 players, closed. Age of Conan, 2008, peaked at 700,000 players, maintenance mode. Warhammer Online, 2008, peaked at 800,000 players, closed. Rift, 2011, peaked at 600,000 players, maintenance mode. Of these 4 games, 3 of them surpassed the peak numbers of Everquest. Now, of course, peak numbers don't mean a whole hell of a lot for longevity, but many of these games only lasted a few years before active development stopped. The leashes seemed to get shorter as these challengers went up against the brick wall that was World of Warcraft, and ultimately fell short over and over again. Games trying to be the WoW killer succumbed to the weight of the behemoth that it was. And honestly, it makes sense. If you're imitating a game and fail at doing so, what are your options? The main question here is what counted as a failure? What internal metrics needed to be met to make the game worthwhile to continue? Many playable worlds that became beloved by players all around the world would close during this period, and they continue to do so to this day, though the variables of their closures are broad with the inclusion of now major monetization issues. But one thing has remained: WoW's success. The incredible numbers it hit tower over the genre in most cases. Games like Guild Wars 2 and Final Fantasy XIV have both sold over 10 million copies of their games, but that can't even begin to match the long-term success of WoW, which over its last 2 expansions, prior to Dragonflight, sold over 3 million copies on day 1 alone. Perhaps the success of WoW has set the bar too high, and the idea of a successful MMO may need to be reworked. Even WoW isn't immune to its own high standard, as industry outlets have been pointing out the decline in day 1 expansion sales for Dragonflight, without considering that many games would love those declining sales. So let me ask you, is a game that has 100,000 players who are actively enjoying the game a success? What about 500,000 or 1 million? I can't speak to the finances of an MMO, but to me, a successful and thriving MMO has always been the type of game that is able to fund active development and has a healthy enough player base that in-game activities are functional. But clearly, that was not the bar that was set for many games that closed in the shadow of World of Warcraft. And if you think of this whole section as really just a way for me to gripe about the closure of Vanguard Saga of Heroes, you're probably right. But there was one thing I do blame World of Warcraft for, and that is the final pillar. Group finders, instant dungeons, flying, fast travel, raid finders, instance PvP, AoE skills, solo ability, guided essential questing, and even once present crafting skill barriers being removed with each expansion. Year after year, World of Warcraft seemed to add a new way to streamline accessing content in World of Warcraft, setting the tone for all the games trying to copy WoW to do the same. None of these things are inherently bad or wrong, but they do represent a trade-off. And as the industry leader, WoW set the tone for about a decade, leading to a lot of players bemoaning the loss of struggle in MMOs. How WoW had simplified it all while stripping out social elements. And in some ways, this arms race to create the easiest way to get into an MMO even turned off some World of Warcraft players as things got overwhelming. There is a reason why World of Warcraft Classic and the announcements of Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King were met with so much excitement by the community. It was a return to some of the things that World of Warcraft did well at the beginning of its tenure, and some of the things that it had lost. As Josh Hayes eloquently put it in his video, Why Older MMOs Feel Better, the loss of struggle in MMOs has led to faster dopamine hits early on, but the lack of the long-lasting feeling of achievement that accompanied struggling. Now this is probably where I diverge from Josh Hayes, because he may consider WoW as part of these older MMOs. After all, it did launch in 2004, almost 2 decades ago. But there's a reason why WoW has bisected itself into a classic version and a current version. With patches and expansions over the years, the live version of WoW stripped away struggle in favor of those early game experiences. It continued over years and years, with WoW setting the tone in this sort of arms race of making things simpler. The jury remains out if this is good or bad for the genre, as you'll probably see in the comment section. There are a lot of strong, passionate opinions about struggle in MMOs and group finders, etc. What can't be denied, though, is that the genre changed with WoW. The early experience became more important to get right and usually easier, more solo friendly, and less social. That's all a simplification, of course, but in general, that is what was happening all across the genre. Ease of access to the content became the norm, with World of Warcraft leading the way in many of these innovations as they doubled and tripled down on hooking players early. Even old stalwart games like Everquest began to add in new quality of life features like instancing off group content and raids, adding in maps and the like. What made this so detrimental to the MMO genre is connected to the first pillar. With everyone seeking to follow WoW's formula, no one was risking turning players off with struggle. This left players who wanted this type of game with precious few options, consolidating in older games or leaving the genre completely. In an article titled MMORPG Metamorphosis: How the Industry Changed, Anderson Addo tackled this problem as well with a section called The Evil of Instant Gratification. In this, Anderson echoes some of the points made by Josh Hayes and myself about how MMOs in this era post-WoW were facing uphill battles to retain players. In order to retain players who stumble upon their games or try them out for the first time, they had to compete with the instant gratification being granted by WoW's systems. It became necessary to strip away some of that early barriers that would pay off later. This meant making games easier and more soloable, at least early on, giving that initial burst of dopamine. The quality of life arms race had begun. World of Warcraft opened up MMORPG worlds to a new sort of antisocial MMO player. Kind of. I say kind of because while I was deeply social in games like Everquest, I was distinctly antisocial anywhere outside city limits in games like Ultima Online, because people could be, and usually were, deadly. But the antisocial player became a key demographic with WoW and continues to be to this day. Systems in the game allow for it or even encourage it. Group finders, solo quests, raid finders, battlegrounds, and arenas all remove social barriers. Even the nature of WoW dungeons, which speed you through content, often require little to no communication, and when communication is needed, there's often an add-on that can assist you. It all becomes streamlined. And that's not to say this is entirely bad. Millions upon millions of players love this style of MMO. The problem lies for players who don't, and for the players who want to try something new. For years, no one dared, and WoW itself continued deeper and deeper down this path. They set the tone. So, did WoW kill the MMO genre? No, we're playing MMOs now. It obviously has not killed the genre. WoW itself is still successful. You have a classic version that's doing well as its current live version. And I think games like Black Desert Online, Guild Wars 2, and Elder Scrolls Online have shown the industry has a bit more appetite to innovate than they did before. While they are still sticking closely to the formula that WoW created, there are at least some parts where they are branching out, notably in combat, for example, and single player stories that actually WoW has started to emulate, or different mount styles that also WoW has started to emulate. At this point, I think we are starting to see some of the health of the genre come back, where it is no longer just one game putting everything on the rest of the genre. WoW itself taking things from other MMOs, to me, is a beautiful thing to see, because it means that other games are innovating and doing things in a way that WoW is seeing as good. New MMOs are being announced that are focusing on things like immersive weather effects, PvP, node systems, social grouping, sandbox crafting, exploration, and in-game housing. Some of the things that people like Raph Koster felt were gone. They're coming back. The problem was never WoW. WoW is a game, just like Everquest or Guild Wars 2 or Final Fantasy XIV. The problem was WoW's success and the reaction to the genre. There was too much copying, too little innovation, and WoW itself leaning into the very things that would remove struggle and ease players into the game, seeking those early dopamine hits, completely changing the game, even from itself and its initial success. Only time will tell if the genre is healthy enough now to weather this and continue with new and exciting innovations in the future. I think the genre was set back about 10 years with this lack of innovation, and that may hurt it long term. We just have to wait and see, because unfortunately, MMORPGs take a very, very long time to develop. And with a player base that's increasingly unforgiving, that's difficult. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I've got some good news for you, because there's actually going to be a part 2. The part 2 is going to be about how WoW saved MMOs. But in this video, I referenced Josh Drive Hayes and their wonderful video on why old school MMOs feel better, why old MMOs feel better. Well, I covered that in this video here, and if you want to take a look and see what I had to say, go over there and take a look. My name is Redbeard Flynn. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.